few have heard of Easter Island's folklore as recorded by its relatively unknown early inhabitants, the Waitaha, who describe Easter Island as an archipelago. This was many thousands of years ago, before the rise in sea level, when, they say, the stars shone in a different sky and a different pattern. Every year the Waitaha said they welcomed the appearance of the double-hull canoe of the gods, and they called them Urukeu. Now the Urukeu are described as star walkers and long-distance voyagers who travelled across the Pacific to and from a place called Kainga Nui Nui, which means the enormous land. And then one year the canoe failed to return when, I quote, angry stars gathered close to the moon to give birth to the tides of chaos, the dreaded deluge. So this alone places them on Easter Island before 9700 BC, which is the geological date of the Great Flood. The Urukeu survived titanic waves in the Pacific and reached New Zealand. 2 generations after the world turned by water, a female descendant called Hotumatua arrived back on Easter Island with 7 sages. Hotumatua was given charge of mapping the Pacific and its missing lands, many of which had become islands due to rapidly rising sea levels, including her own homeland. And then other descendants of the Urukeu arrived from a continent to the east, where they'd lived for a long period of time. And these Urukeu are described as tall, fair-skinned, red-haired with green eyes and blonde with blue eyes. And their image is said to be depicted in the oldest moai of Easter Island, whose extended chins portray beards, while the cylinders carved from red scoria and balanced on their heads depict their unusual hair color, at least to people of the Pacific. And even though the Waitaha account is over 11,000 years old, there is no mention of carving the moai. The statues are already an accepted presence on the island, a testament to their extreme antiquity. And this is proved by the location of the quarry, which now lies 80 feet below sea level, submerged by the rising ocean at the end of the Uinta Dryas. After the world turned by water, the grandchildren of the Urukeu set sail from Easter Island to locate the birthplace of the gods, a remote mountain region on New Zealand's South Island. The 3 sacred sites stand in a place of unparalleled beauty. Tekohanga, also known as the Sacred Nest, was once surrounded by a lake and resembled a primordial island. The second, Kuratauhiti, means distant school. It was the academy of the Urukeu, with each stone said to hold the wisdom of the gods. Among the hundreds of weathered limestone outcrops stand other monoliths, one shaped by human hands, by the Keepers of Stone, a group of stonemasons whom the Waitaha described as able to shape stone without breaking its spirit. I recall the first time I saw these monoliths and remarking how many of them don't look natural. They seem to be shaped by human hands, but obviously very weathered. And it was impossible to prove until I read the Waitaha tradition, in which they describe the carving of the stones, particularly that of their tutelary goddess Marotini. And their story goes like this. Huge are the monuments recarved at Tekohanga. A towering column of the purest stone was shaped to place Marotini in the land. We asked so much of the stone shapers when they carved her to stand against the stars. Tall timbers and thick ropes lifted them high above the land to carve Marotini. Ever higher they climbed to cut away the curving charcoal lines, to reveal the beauty of our ancestor. When might the birthplace of the gods have been established? If the Urukeu were already navigating the Pacific long before the flood, ostensibly they could have been in New Zealand before 10,000 BC. The Waitaha narrative describes a calendar stone somewhere amid the birthplace of the gods. Since ancient temples memorialize the date of their creation by referencing specific stars or constellations, if the calendar stone could be located, it would provide a date reference. This worldwide practice is called Archaeoastronomy. I spent a few years hiking the ridges of the birthplace of the gods, but nothing resembling a calendar stone really stood out, so I took my search to a third ridge. As if the views of the valley aren't enough of a distraction, there are also hundreds of limestone outcrops to choose from, and many have clearly been shaped by water, undoubtedly. But as I approached an escarpment, the main sacred site at Urukeu came into view in the distance. And at that moment, one monolith stood out from the rest. It didn't look like an active erosion. It looked like a kind of sundial with a protrusion resembling a head and a faint image of eyes, nose, and a mouth. But best of all, the only bird in the entire valley was perched on this stone, a falcon, of all things. And had I been an ancient Egyptian, I would have said Horus is nodding in agreement. And these coincidences happen all the time when researching ancient mysteries, so I figured this was a good omen and began taking measurements of the sky. So I stood in front of the disk with the head aligned at the top ridge, and I took a compass bearing and altitude. But what was I supposed to be aligning it to? Well, there are two principal constellations in the mythology of the Waitaha, one being the Southern Cross. So, if we roll back the sky to the time of the flood, this constellation only begins to appear above the stone on the spring equinox of 14,800 BC, with the Milky Way, this celestial river, flowing vertically as though pouring out of the stone. The effect must have been magical. And this is correct. Then the Urukeu would have had to have been there before the start of the oldest Dryas. But there's another possibility, and that's the second constellation of note, which is Orion, specifically its belt stars. Now, Orion does not rise above the background mountain range for another 4,000 years, until the spring equinox of 10,800 BC, when its belt aligns perfectly with the calendar stone. And the date happens to coincide with a period of meteorite impacts that triggered the Younger Dryas. But to see the entire constellation, one has to wait until the equinox in 10,400 BC. And I got goosebumps when this date popped up because it is commemorated at several prominent monuments around the world, the most well-known being the Pyramids of Giza, which mirror the belt of Orion exactly on the same occasion. Well, it turns out that there are a number of overlapping relationships between the gods of Egypt and the Urukeu. At the same time that Orion appears fully above the calendar stone, across the valley at Urukeu, the goddess Marotini